The Mercer estate encompassed 3,000 acres of Georgia, low country, a place where the red earth seemed to guard memories the way ground retains water. On that October morning in 1847, a neighbor's boy approached the main house carrying news about the upcoming county fair and stumbled upon something that would haunt that corner of the South for generations to come. The dining table remained fully arranged. The meal had gone cold. The wax had melted down to nothing. Every chair stood vacant, yet the family had simply evaporated. No sign of conflict remained, no written explanation, not a single clue. Just an abandoned supper and an enigma that would generate countless explanations. Each one lacking credibility, each somehow darker than the previous. Before we delve deeper into what became of the Mercer household, that evening they ceased to exist within their own walls. If you're hearing this somewhere below the Mason-Dixon line, or if you've ever pondered those American families who disappeared without explanation, share your location in the comments. I'm curious whether this narrative reaches those living near where these puzzles unfolded. And if this mystery already has you feeling unsettled, click that subscribe button now, because we're about to reveal what truly transpired inside that plantation dwelling. The Mercers weren't particularly distinguished among Georgia's planting families. Thomas Mercer had received the property from his father along with the substantial obligations that accompanied it. At 43, he possessed the sort of features suggesting he'd spent years calculating figures. His gaze remained sharp, constantly shifting, perpetually evaluating. His wife Ella Lenina, a decade younger, came from Charleston merchant stock. She'd married beneath herself socially, but gained land in exchange. Her attractiveness resulted from deliberate cultivation. Her dark hair stayed perfectly arranged. Her gowns remained the finest money could procure, and her expression never quite reached her eyes. Their offspring numbered 3. Catherine, the eldest at 19, had been promised to a neighboring landowner's son, an arrangement that would merge 2 considerable holdings. She stayed reserved, the type who appeared to watch rather than participate, possessing her mother's refined features alongside her father's calculating expression. Then came William, 17, destined to inherit the plantation and prepared for that responsibility since infancy. He possessed that effortless confidence young men often display, suggesting he'd never questioned his position. Margaret, merely 14, remained suspended between girlhood and whatever followed. She alone among them seemed to laugh genuinely. The estate itself sprawled considerably. The primary residence followed federal design principles, featuring white pillars and a veranda that captured afternoon sunlight. It had undergone enlargement twice since its 1789 construction, resulting in an asymmetrical appearance, as though the structure couldn't determine its own identity. The grounds received meticulous attention. The grass kept short, the plantings trimmed, the outbuildings freshly painted and arranged. Everything about the Mercer property suggested mastery, precision, carefully maintained prosperity. But mastery, as anyone familiar with Southern life understands, remains fundamentally deceptive. The domestic workforce comprised roughly 40 enslaved individuals, though the count varied. A head housekeeper named Ruth had served 23 years, managing household operations with determination matching Ella Lenina's. A cook called Samuel had trained in Charleston and took genuine pride in his work. Meals from his kitchen ranked among the county's finest. Field hands existed, stable workers, a smith, a carpenter, and numerous others whose identities remained known only to those sharing their daily existence. That Tuesday evening passed without distinction. October's weather stayed mild, almost summery, though dampness hinted at approaching rain. The household gathered for their customary 7 o'clock dinner. Samuel had prepared roasted chicken, fresh garden vegetables, morning baked bread, and custard for dessert. Candles illuminated the dining space. Gas lighting hadn't reached this Georgia region yet, and the table displayed their finest china, reserved for impressing guests. Yet no visitor attended that evening, no relative called, no neighbor stopped by. Nothing warranted the good dishes. Ilalina had simply decided they would dine formally, according to Ruth, who'd helped prepare. Tuesday. Nothing suggested this evening would differ from any other. The family began eating at 7. Ruth served, then retreated to the kitchen as usual. Samuel waited there with 2 younger servants who handled washing and clearing. The dining room door remained closed throughout meals. The family preferred privacy while eating, and servants understood not to interrupt unless summoned. At 8:30, Ruth went to remove the first course. She knocked properly, receiving no response. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. She opened the door slowly, expecting to find them still eating, perhaps talking, maybe having lost track of time. Instead, she discovered a scene that witnesses would later describe as unnatural, impossible, as though they'd simply stopped existing. The table remained exactly as left. The first course had been cleared. The soup plates were gone, indicating they'd eaten at least that much. The main course remained, however. The chicken had cooled completely. The vegetables had started wilting. The bread had stiffened. The candles had burned down considerably, suggesting substantial time had passed. But every chair sat vacant. All 4, Thomas, Ilalina, Catherine, William. Margaret's chair also stood empty, though her plate remained nearly untouched. The room showed no disturbance. The windows stayed closed and latched inside. The door through which Ruth had entered provided the only access, and no one had passed through it. The candlesticks remained upright. The tablecloth bore no struggle marks, as though the family had simply risen and walked away, abandoning everything exactly as it was. Ruth's scream brought Samuel running. He found her in the doorway, hand covering her mouth, complexion paper, white. Other servants gathered behind him, and within minutes everyone understood something inexplicable had occurred. The search commenced immediately. They examined the house thoroughly. Every chamber, every cupboard, every space potentially concealing a person. They searched the grounds with torches as darkness fell. They combed nearby woods. They checked the river bordering the eastern property line, finding nothing. By midnight, neighbors had arrived, and by dawn nearly 50 men scoured the countryside for any trace of the missing family. They discovered nothing. The county sheriff arrived October 15th. James Harrow had held his position 12 years without encountering anything truly puzzling. County crimes typically proved straightforward: stolen horses, drunken altercations, occasional theft. He understood simple explanations and simple resolutions. The Mercer disappearance was neither. Harrow proceeded methodically. He interviewed Ruth first, in the kitchen with Samuel present. Ruth's account remained consistent and detailed. The family sitting down, meal served, door closed. She described dining room sounds: silverware clinking, conversation murmuring, nothing unusual. She described the silence around 8 o'clock, which she'd assumed meant they were finishing. She described opening the door and finding emptiness. "Did you observe them leaving?" Harrow asked. "No, sir." "Could they have used the windows?" "The windows were latched inside, sir. I verified myself." "Could they have passed through the kitchen?" "No, sir. I remained in the kitchen continuously. No one came through." Harrow questioned other servants. Their accounts matched Ruth's. No one had seen the family leave the dining room. No one had heard distress sounds or struggle, as though they'd simply evaporated. Harrow then examined the dining room personally. He searched for foul play evidence, struggle indications, anything suggesting what had occurred. He found nothing. The room remained orderly. The table was set. The food waited. The candles had burned down, indicating the family had occupied the room for some time after sitting, yet no explanation for their absence existed. He questioned neighbors who'd participated in the initial search. They confirmed thorough house examination, no bodies discovered, no family traces anywhere on the grounds. One neighbor, Garrett, mentioned something peculiar. The stable horses remained present, every one. If the family had fled, they'd have taken horses, yet the animals stayed undisturbed in their stalls. This detail troubled Harrow. It suggested the family hadn't departed voluntarily. But if they hadn't departed, where were they? Over subsequent days, Harrow interviewed everyone connected to the household. He spoke with enslaved plantation workers. Though these interviews remained superficial, he apparently assumed they possessed no useful information, or that if they did, they'd never share it with a white lawman. He questioned neighbors and distant relatives. He spoke with Catherine's intended, a planter named Hutchkins living 5 miles away. Hutchkins appeared genuinely shocked by the news and expressed concern for Catherine's welfare, though something in his tone suggested primarily financial concern. The marriage would have brought him considerable property. 1 week after the disappearance, Harrow made a public statement. He announced that the Mercer family had vanished under mysterious circumstances, that foul play couldn't be excluded, and that anyone with information should come forward. He offered $50 for information leading to the family's discovery. In 1847, $50 represented a substantial sum, enough to feed a household for months. No one came forward. Weeks became months. The search gradually ceased. The reward remained unclaimed. The Mercer plantation fell into uncertainty. The enslaved workers technically remained Thomas Mercer's property, but with no master directing them, their position grew ambiguous. Some stayed on the property, continuing their work from habit or fear of what might happen if they left. Others drifted away, disappearing into the countryside or making their way toward larger towns where they might find work or anonymity. The house itself began deteriorating. Without Ilalina's careful oversight and the servants' daily attention, gardens grew wild. Paint peeled from the columns. The veranda developed rot. The interior, once so meticulously maintained, showed neglect signs. Dust accumulated on furniture. Curtains faded in sunlight. The dining room where the family had vanished became a space people avoided. The table remained exactly as discovered, as though removing it might somehow erase the final evidence of what had occurred. By late 1847, the Mercer disappearance had become local legend. People told stories about what had happened that night. Some claimed spirits had taken the family, punishment for some sin they'd committed. Others suggested abolitionists had kidnapped them, transporting them north. Still others whispered about curses, about the land itself rejecting those who worked it, about debts settled in blood rather than currency. But the truth, as usual, proved far more complicated and far more human. To understand what happened to the Mercer family, one must first understand the nature of the household they inhabited. On the surface, it represented order and control. But beneath that surface, like rot concealed beneath polished wood, fractures had been widening for years. Thomas Mercer's financial situation stood far more precarious than most realized. The plantation generated profit, yes, but insufficient profit to support the lifestyle Ilalina demanded. She came from merchant stock, people accustomed to wealth and luxury, and she had no intention of living as a mere planter's wife. She wanted the finest things, the best clothing, the most impressive entertainments. Thomas had indulged her, and in doing so, had accumulated increasingly unmanageable debts. By 1847, Thomas owed money to 3 different Savannah creditors. He owed money to a Charleston banker. He owed money to an Atlanta merchant. The debts were substantial, and the creditors grew impatient. Letters arrived, their tone increasingly threatening. Foreclosure talk circulated. The plantation might be seized to satisfy what was owed. Thomas had begun drinking more heavily, a fact noted by those who saw him in town. He'd become withdrawn, irritable, prone to sudden rages followed by deep melancholy. Elenina, for her part, seemed oblivious to the financial crisis. Or perhaps she wasn't oblivious. Perhaps she simply refused to acknowledge it. She continued ordering expensive Charleston fabrics. She continued planning elaborate entertainments. She continued living as though money would never run out, as though the debts represented merely a temporary inconvenience Thomas would somehow resolve. Catherine, the eldest, understood the situation. Intelligent and observant, she'd overheard parental conversations revealing the true state of affairs. She understood her marriage to Hutchkins wasn't about love, but about financial arrangement, consolidating properties and securing the family's future. She'd accepted this, as young women of her class were expected to accept such things. But she'd also begun to understand that her future wasn't as secure as she'd once believed. William, the heir, remained less aware of the crisis, or perhaps simply chose not to think about it. At 17, confident in his position, convinced he'd inherit the plantation and everything would work out, he possessed no real understanding of the debts, no comprehension of what it meant to manage such a large enterprise. He spent his time riding, hunting, socializing with other young men of his class. He had a girlfriend from a neighboring plantation and was already making future plans. Plans assuming the plantation would remain stable and profitable, waiting for him to take over. Margaret, the youngest, remained largely unaware of the crisis. At 14, she still inhabited childhood's world, still believing her parents were all-powerful, capable of solving any problem, that the world would always continue as it was. But another element existed within the household that no outsider fully understood. A secret kept for years, a secret with the potential to destroy everything. The family's reputation, their social standing, their very position in society. Ruth, the head housekeeper, knew this secret. She'd known it for years and kept it because she had no choice, because the alternative would have been unthinkable. Samuel the cook also knew, though he knew it differently. Through overheard conversation fragments and careful observation by someone living on the household's margins. The secret involved Catherine. Catherine had become pregnant in spring 1847. The father wasn't the man to whom she'd been promised. The father was a young man named Henry Garrett, son of the neighbor who'd mentioned the horses to Sheriff Harrow. Henry was handsome, charming, and completely unsuitable. He had no money, no prospects, no social standing. The kind of young man Elenina would dismiss immediately, the kind Thomas would forbid his daughter to see. But Catherine saw him anyway. She met him secretly, in the woods near the river, in the stable late at night, in the garden when she was supposed to be taking exercise, a brief affair conducted with that desperate passion only young people can manage. When Catherine realized she was pregnant, terror consumed her. She confided in Ruth, the only person she could trust. Ruth helped her. She obtained herbs from an old woman living in the quarters. A woman who understood bodily matters most people preferred not to acknowledge. The herbs worked, though not without cost. Catherine lay ill for days, fevered and weak, moments when Ruth feared for her life. But the pregnancy ended, and Catherine recovered, and the secret remained kept. But secrets, like debts, accumulate interest. They grow heavier with time. They begin poisoning everything they touch. Elenina had begun suspecting something. She'd noticed Catherine's illness, seen how Ruth hovered over her, observed Catherine's careful movements for weeks afterward. Elenina wasn't stupid. She was quite intelligent, and her intelligence focused on detecting threats to her family's standing. She'd begun asking questions carefully, obliquely, in the way women of her class learned to ask without directly accusing. Catherine denied everything, of course. But Elenina didn't believe her. Elenina began watching Catherine more carefully, restricting her movements, questioning her about where she'd been and whom she'd seen. The relationship between mother and daughter, always somewhat distant, became actively hostile. Thomas, meanwhile, remained consumed by financial worries. He barely noticed the tension between his wife and daughter. He spent days managing the plantation, evenings drinking, nights lying awake calculating figures that never quite added up. A man slowly crushed by his own failures, he'd begun contemplating increasingly desperate solutions. William sensed something wrong, but remained too self-absorbed to pay much attention. He was in love, or thought he was, and made future plans that didn't include his family's financial crisis. He assumed his father would solve the problem, as fathers were supposed to do. He assumed his inheritance would wait for him when he came of age. He assumed the world would continue operating according to the rules he'd been taught. Margaret noticed nothing. She was 14, and the adult world remained largely opaque to her. She loved her family and assumed they loved each other, having no idea that beneath their orderly household surface, things were beginning to crack. On that October evening in 1847, all these tensions, all these secrets, all these desperate calculations converged. The meal began normally enough. Samuel had prepared the food, Ruth had served it, and the family started eating. But as the evening progressed, conversation took a turn that might have seemed innocuous to an outside observer, but carried, for those involved, the weight of everything left unsaid for months. Thomas had received a letter that day from the Charleston banker, and it was final. The debts must be paid within 30 days, or the plantation would be seized. Thomas had read the letter multiple times, and by dinner he'd consumed nearly half a bottle of whiskey. His hands shook slightly holding his fork. His eyes had a glassy quality suggesting he wasn't entirely present. Elenina noticed immediately. She always noticed when Thomas drank, and always responded with that cold disapproval making situations worse rather than better. She commented on the wine quality, a subtle criticism really aimed at Thomas's condition. Thomas responded with irritation. Elenina pressed further. Within minutes they were engaged in the kind of argument increasingly common in the household. Ostensibly about one thing, but really about everything. "You have failed," Elenina said, her voice low but sharp. "Failed as provider, as manager, as a man. My father would never have allowed himself such a position." Thomas's face flushed. "Your father was a merchant, Elenina." "Merchants trade goods, not land. It's not the same." "No," Elenina agreed. "It's not the same. My father succeeded." "You haven't?" Catherine, eating quietly, suddenly spoke. "Perhaps if you hadn't insisted on such extravagance, Mother, Father wouldn't be in this position." The table fell silent. Elenina turned toward her daughter, her expression pure shock. Catherine had never directly contradicted her before. Catherine had never spoken to her in such a tone. "What did you say?" Elenina's voice was dangerous. Quiet the way a knife is quiet before cutting. "I said perhaps if you hadn't insisted on such extravagance." "I heard what you said. I'm asking what you meant by it." Catherine's hands shook, but she continued. "I meant you spend money as if it grows on trees. The dresses, the entertainments, the furnishings. You spend without thinking where the money comes from. Elenina rose from the table. You will not speak to me that way. You will apologize immediately. I will not, Catherine said. And then, as if words had been dammed inside her for months and finally broken through, she continued, I won't apologize because it's the truth. You've spent this family into ruin, and you refuse to acknowledge it. You refuse to acknowledge anything that doesn't fit your vision of how things should be. Elenina's face had gone white. You ungrateful, disrespectful child. After everything I've done for you. Everything you've done for me. Catherine's voice rose. You've done nothing for me except try to control me, mold me into something I'm not, sell me to the highest bidder like a piece of property. Thomas, watching this exchange with stunned expression, suddenly slammed his hand on the table.
Enough.
Both of you. Enough. But Elenina wasn't finished. She leaned forward, eyes fixed on Catherine, and said something that would echo through the rest of the evening, like a stone dropped into still water. I know about Henry Garrett. I know what you did. I know what you are. The room seemed to stop. William, eating mechanically, looked up. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Catherine's face had turned ash-colored. I don't know what you're talking about, Catherine whispered. Don't lie to me, Elenina said. I'm not a fool. I know you were with him. I know you became pregnant. I know Ruth helped you dispose of the problem. Thomas's head snapped toward Elenina. What are you talking about? Your precious daughter. Elenina said, voice dripping contempt. Wasn't the innocent girl you thought she was. She's been with a man. She's been with child. That's a lie, Catherine said, barely audible. Is it? Elenina turned to Ruth, frozen by the sideboard. Ruth, tell him. Tell him what you did. Tell him how you helped his daughter commit a sin that would damn her soul. Ruth didn't speak. She stood perfectly still, face a mask. I won't have this conversation, Thomas said, voice shaking with rage and alcohol. I won't have my family's private matters discussed this way. Your family's private matters. Elenina laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your family's reputation is in tatters, Thomas. Your your son is a fool, and you are a failure. And I'm trapped here with all of you, watching everything I've worked for crumble to dust. William stood abruptly. You will not speak about Catherine that way. Sit down, Thomas commanded. I will not, William said. Mother, you're being cruel and unjust. Catherine has done nothing to deserve. Nothing. Elenina's voice was sharp as a blade. She's brought shame upon this family. She's done what any young woman might do, William said. She's fallen in love, and you, with your coldness and cruelty, have made it impossible for her to confide in you, impossible for her to ask for help. Elenina stood, chair scraping the floor. You're all against me. All of you. I've given everything to this family, and this is how you repay me. With ingratitude and disrespect and lies. You've given nothing, Catherine said quietly. You've only taken. You've taken our freedom, our privacy, our right to make our own choices. You've treated us as if we were possessions, things to be controlled and managed for your own benefit. Thomas stood, his chair falling backward. This conversation is over. Elenina, you will go to your room. Catherine, you will. He paused, as if unsure what to say next. You will also go to your room. William, Margaret, finish your dinner. But no one finished their dinner. Elenina swept from the room, back rigid with anger. Catherine followed, head high but hands shaking. William sat back down, face flushed with emotion. Margaret, who hadn't spoken throughout the exchange, began crying silently, tears running down her cheeks without sound. Thomas stood at the table's head, looking at the ruins of his meal. The cold food, the burned down candles, and something inside him seemed to break. He sat slowly, as if his legs would no longer support him. He put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, though it was unclear to whom he apologized. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." William reached over and put his hand on his father's shoulder. "Father, it will be all right. We'll find a way through this." But Thomas didn't respond. He sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking silently, and the candles burned down. And the food grew cold, and the evening stretched into a darkness that seemed endless. What happened after that moment is where the story becomes truly strange. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of the terrible logic of human desperation. Following the dinner table confrontation, the family scattered. Evelina went to her room and locked the door. Catherine went to her room and did the same. William sat with his father a while, trying to comfort him, but eventually he too withdrew. Margaret was sent to bed by Ruth, who tucked her in and told her everything would be all right, a lie they both recognized as such. Thomas remained in the dining room. He sat at the table alone and drank. He drank the wine left in glasses. He drank from the bottle brought for dinner. When that finished, he sent for more. Ruth, seeing his condition, brought it without comment. Around 9 o'clock, Evelina came back downstairs. She'd changed clothes and composed herself, finding Thomas still at the table. She said something to him. No one knows exactly what. No one was there to hear. But whatever she said, it was the final straw. Thomas stood and grabbed her arm and said something in return. Evelina tried pulling away, and there was a struggle lasting only seconds. Then Evelina fell. She fell backward, her head striking the sideboard's edge. She fell hard and didn't get up. Thomas stood staring at what he'd done, and the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. His wife lay unconscious, possibly dead. His family lay in ruins. His debts were unpayable. His reputation was destroyed, and he just committed an act that, if discovered, would result in his execution. He called for William. His son came downstairs, and Thomas told him what had happened. William's face went white, but he didn't panic. Instead, he did what his father asked. He helped carry Evelina to the cellar. They laid her on a cot kept there for storage, and covered her with a blanket. Then Thomas went upstairs and called for Catherine. He told her mother had had an accident, was resting, and would be fine. Catherine, still angry and hurt, didn't ask questions. She accepted what she was told. But Catherine was intelligent, and as the evening wore on, she began piecing together what had actually happened. She began understanding with terrible clarity that her mother wasn't resting, wasn't going to be fine, that something far worse had occurred. She went to William's room and confronted him. William, exhausted and traumatized, told her the truth. Catherine's reaction was shock and horror, but also perhaps grim understanding. Her mother had pushed everyone to the breaking point. Her mother had been cruel and controlling and impossible to live with. And now her mother was gone, and nothing could be done about it. The three of them, Thomas, William, and Catherine, sat together in darkness and tried figuring out what to do. They couldn't call a doctor. They couldn't tell anyone what happened. If they did, Thomas would hang. The family would be destroyed. Everything would be lost. Thomas, in his desperation and drunkenness, began formulating a plan. A plan born of panic and alcohol, and the magical thinking that comes when someone confronts an impossible situation. He would leave. He would take William and Catherine, and they would disappear. They would go west to the frontier where no one knew them, where they could start over. They would leave the plantation, leave the debts, leave Evelina's body in the cellar, and begin again. But there was a problem. Margaret. Margaret was 14 and couldn't be left behind. If left behind, she would eventually tell someone what had happened. She would be questioned and would break, and the truth would emerge. So Margaret would have to come with them. And there was another problem. Ruth. Ruth knew too much. Ruth had been in the house when Elenina fell. Ruth had helped carry Elenina to the cellar. Ruth knew Elenina was dead. Ruth couldn't be left behind either. She too would eventually tell someone what happened, so Thomas made a decision that would haunt the region for generations. He decided Ruth would have to disappear as well. He called Ruth to his study. He told her the family was leaving, going west, and she would come with them. Ruth, who had served the family 23 years, who had helped raise the children, who had kept their secrets, understood immediately what was happening. She understood Elenina was dead. She understood the family was fleeing. And she understood she was being given a choice. Come with them or be left behind to face consequences. Ruth agreed to come. What choice did she have? Samuel the cook wasn't told. Samuel wasn't part of the family's inner circle. Samuel was a servant, and servants weren't trusted with such secrets. But Samuel was intelligent and began suspecting something wrong. He noticed Elenina hadn't come to the kitchen for daily instructions. He noticed the family seemed agitated, moving about the house in darkness, gathering things together. Around midnight, Samuel went to the dining room to clear the table, as was his habit. He found it exactly as left. The food still there, candles burned down, chairs empty. He knew immediately something terrible had happened. He didn't know what to do. He was enslaved, and the people he would normally report to, the white household members, were involved in whatever had occurred. He couldn't go to authorities because he wasn't sure what he'd witnessed, and because he knew his testimony would carry little weight. He was a black man in the South in 1847, and a black man's word against a white family's would never stand in court. So Samuel did what he could. He went to the quarters and told the other enslaved people what he'd found. He told them the family had disappeared, something terrible had happened, and they should prepare for whatever came next. By dawn, the Mercer family was gone. Thomas, Elenina's body, William, Catherine, and Margaret had left the plantation in darkness. They'd taken horses, supplies, and whatever money Thomas could gather. They'd left behind a household in chaos, a plantation without a master, and a mystery that would never be fully solved. Ruth went with them. She went because she had no choice, because she'd been complicit in what happened, because she understood her only survival chance lay in staying with the family that had owned her so long. Samuel remained behind. He remained and kept the secret, and lived with knowledge of what had happened, and he never told anyone the truth. Not in his lifetime, not until he was old and dying, finally confessing to a younger man what he'd witnessed that night. The story of what happened to the Mercer family after leaving the plantation is a story of desperation, of the terrible logic of people trying to outrun their own crimes, of the way one act of violence can trigger a chain reaction destroying everything it touches. They traveled west, moving at night, avoiding main roads, staying in small towns where no one knew them. Thomas told people they were moving for a fresh start, that he'd sold his plantation, that they sought opportunities on the frontier. Most accepted this without question. The frontier was full of people running from something: debts, scandals, failed marriages, broken dreams. No one asked too many questions, but Elenina's body was a problem. Thomas had wrapped it carefully, told the children they were transporting goods, hidden it in a covered wagon. But as weeks passed, as weather warmed, as the body decomposed, the smell became impossible to ignore. Thomas had to dispose of it. He chose a remote location, a ravine in the Tennessee mountains, and left Elalina there, buried under rocks, hidden from the world. The children never spoke of it. They'd been traumatized by what they'd witnessed, by their complicity in their mother's death, by the knowledge they were living a lie. But they didn't speak of it, because speaking would mean acknowledging what happened, and acknowledging what happened would mean facing consequences. They made it to Arkansas, a small town on the frontier's edge. Thomas used a false name. He called himself Thomas Mercer Still, not creative enough to invent a new identity, and purchased land. He told people he was a Georgia planter who'd come west to escape heat and humidity, seeking a fresh start. For a time, it seemed they might actually succeed. The land was fertile. Crops grew. Thomas began establishing himself in the community. William, now 18, began thinking about his future. Catherine, now 20, began thinking about marriage again, though she chose carefully, selecting a man who wouldn't ask too many questions about her past. But Ruth was dying. The journey west had been hard on her. She was older, and the stress of what happened, the knowledge of what she'd done, the weight of the secret she carried had taken its toll. Within a year of arriving in Arkansas, she fell ill with a fever that wouldn't break. She lay in a small cabin on Thomas's property edge and called for Thomas, telling him she was going to die and couldn't die with the secret still inside her. Thomas sat with her in darkness, and Ruth told him she'd written down everything that happened. She'd written it in a journal, in careful hand, documenting the events of that night, the dinner table confrontation, Elalina's fall, the decision to flee. She'd hidden the journal, she told him, and if anything happened to her, if she died, the journal would be found and the truth would emerge. Thomas was horrified. He demanded to know where the journal was. Ruth refused to tell him. She said the journal was insurance. The only thing ensuring the truth would eventually be known, that Elalina's death wouldn't be forgotten, that the family wouldn't simply erase what happened and start over. Ruth died 3 days later. Thomas searched her cabin thoroughly but couldn't find the journal. He searched the property. He searched the town. He never found it, and so the secret remained. The family continued living their Arkansas lives, always looking over their shoulders, always afraid someone would discover the truth, always waiting for the moment the past would catch up with them. Thomas died in 1862 during the Civil War. Pneumonia. William survived the war and became a successful farmer. Catherine married and had children, living a long life but never speaking of her mother, never mentioning Georgia, never allowing questions about her past. Margaret grew up and married, having her own family. She lived to 87, and on her deathbed finally told her daughter what had happened that night. Her daughter, shocked and horrified, didn't know what to do with the information. By then, everyone involved was dead. No one to prosecute, no one to hold accountable. The truth had become a ghost, a story whispered, a mystery never solved. The Georgia plantation fell into ruin. The house with its white columns and wraparound porch slowly collapsed. The dining room, where the family had vanished, was eventually swallowed by forest. By the early 20th century, nothing remained but scattered stones and the memory of what had been. But the story persisted. Told and retold, embellished and exaggerated until it became legend. People said the family had been taken by spirits, cursed, punished for some sin they'd committed. The dinner table, according to some versions, remained there still set, still waiting for the family to return. The candles, according to others, still burned, still casting light on empty chairs. The truth, as usual, proved far more mundane and far more tragic. No curse, no supernatural intervention, no divine punishment. Only a family destroyed by secrets, by the weight of unspoken resentments, by the terrible logic of desperation. Only a woman too controlling, a man too weak, children caught in the middle, a servant forced to choose between loyalty and survival. And a dinner table set with good china, with food that grew cold, with candles that burned to stubs, left behind as evidence of a moment when everything changed, when a family ceased existing as a unit and became instead individuals running from their own shadows. The Mercer family mystery was never officially solved. Sheriff Harrow eventually abandoned his investigation and moved to other cases. The reward remained unclaimed. The family's disappearance was eventually attributed to voluntary flight. Though no one could explain why they'd leave that way, why they'd abandon their home and property, why they'd leave a meal sitting on the table. Over the years, various theories emerged. Some believed abolitionists kidnapped them and took them north. Others believed enslaved people seeking revenge killed them. Still others believed they simply decided to start over, leave their old life behind and begin anew in the West. A few, mostly those who'd known Ruth or heard stories from her family, believed something darker occurred, something involving violence and secrets and desperate flight in darkness. But the truth, the real truth, the one Ruth had written in her journal, the one Margaret finally revealed on her deathbed, remained hidden for more than a century. Only in the 1960s, when a historian researching regional history came across reference to a journal supposedly hidden on the Mercer Plantation, did things change. He searched for it, following old maps and old stories, and eventually found it, buried in a sealed box beneath the ruins of what had once been Ruth's cabin. The journal was water, damaged and difficult to read in places, but the essential facts were clear. Ilalina had died in a fall. Thomas had panicked. The family had fled. Ruth had been taken with them. And the truth had been hidden away, preserved in ink and paper, waiting for the day someone would finally read it and understand what really happened. The historian published his findings in an academic journal, but the story never gained much traction. Too late. Everyone involved was dead. No one to prosecute, no one to hold accountable. The mystery had been solved, but the solution was so mundane, so human, so utterly lacking the supernatural drama people had expected that many refused to believe it. They preferred stories about curses and spirits and divine punishment. They preferred the mystery to the truth. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Mercer family's disappearance. We're drawn to mysteries, not because we want to know the truth, but because we want to believe something more exists in life than ordinary human dramas of ambition, resentment, desperation, and fear. We want to believe forces operate in the world, beyond our understanding, that explanations exist for the inexplicable, that transcend mundane reality of human weakness and human failure. But the truth is often far more terrible than any mystery. The truth is that a family can be destroyed not by curses or spirits, but by simple inability to communicate, by the weight of secrets, by the terrible choices people make when desperate and afraid. The truth is that a woman can die not because she was wicked or cursed, but because she was controlling and cold, and because her husband was weak and drunk. The truth is that children can be traumatized not by supernatural forces, but by the knowledge that their parents are capable of terrible things. The Mercer Plantation is gone now. The land has been reclaimed by forest. The dining room, where the family vanished, exists only in memory and in the stories people tell. But the mystery remains, not because it was never solved, but because people continue preferring the mystery to the truth. What do you think happened that night? Do you believe the family simply fled? Or do you think more exists to the story than we've been told? Do you think Ilalina's death was truly an accident? Or do you think Thomas intended to harm her? Do you think Ruth's journal told the whole truth? Or do you think secrets remain hidden, mysteries still waiting to be uncovered? Leave your comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me where you're listening from. And if you enjoyed this story, if it gave you chills, if it made you think about the secrets families keep and the terrible choices people make when desperate and afraid, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries, because so many more stories like this exist. So many more mysteries waiting to be told. So many more secrets hidden in the past, waiting for someone to finally bring them into the light.